As voted by you, my locals members, this is the article of the night. Misinformed about what? What it means to be a science literate citizen in a digital world. It is the Thursday night study review. Let us begin. So, as I mentioned at the open here, I've been running it lately, and I will continue to run it because I like it myself. It always gets me reading something interesting. What I've been doing for my locals members exclusively, you all get to vote if you're a member of my locals. You basically get 4 taglines from me once a week. I usually try to post it on Fridays or Saturdays. You get a couple of days to vote. And based upon each tagline is assigned to an article that I found. You get to vote on that tagline, which article you want to have reviewed on this long-form discussion with the long-form video, really, with the Thursday night study review. And this was the one voted for by my locals members on science literacy in a digital world, effectively. We're misinformed about what it means to be a science literate citizen in a digital world. As always, abstract first. Science literacy is often held up as crucial for avoiding science-related misinformation and enabling more informed individual and collective decision-making. But research has not yet examined whether science literacy actually enables this, nor what skills it would need to encompass to do so. In this report, we address 3 questions to outline what it should mean to be a science literate citizen, in today's world. 1, how should we conceptualize science literacy? 2, how can we achieve this science literacy? And 3, what can we expect science literacy's most important outcomes to be? If science literacy is to truly enable people to become and stay informed and avoid being misinformed on complex science issues, it requires skills that span the life cycle, quote unquote, of science information. This includes how the scientific community produces science information, how media repackage and share the information, and how individuals encounter and form opinions on this information. Science literacy, then, is best conceptualized as encompassing 3 dimensions of literacy spanning the life cycle: civic science literacy, digital media literacy, and cognitive science literacy. Achieving such science literacy, particularly for adults, poses many challenges and will likely require a structural perspective. Digital divides, in particular, are a major structural barrier, and community literacy and building science literacy into media and science communication are promising opportunities. We end the discussion of what some of the potential outcomes will be, and as importantly, will likely not be, of science literacy that furthers informed and critical engagement with science in democratic society. Okay. So, being that things are the way they are in some of the world, and the bit of differences between postmodernists, colloquially termed woke, and the more liberal tradition, classical liberal tradition, that is usually involved in Western democracies or in democracies in general, and republics for that matter. There's always a question that I have in my head when I'm reading some of these things of what is the definition, and does the author define what they mean by some of these things? It's not a positive or negative either way with respect to the article. It's more of a question. How are these things being defined? And so it's a very good thing to ask these kinds of questions. Again, how is it being defined? Here, what is the definition of science? What is the definition of a bunch of different things? So we'll get into that. There's a couple of other things I noted because, I've got my papers here with all of my notes. So pardon me if I'm looking down to, that's the wrong article. Hello. Pardon me if I'm looking down just to check and make sure I've got my notes in front of me. I'm glad I checked to look because otherwise I'd be talking about something that is not in front of you on the screen. Whoops. It's been a long day, folks. Excuse me. Let us continue, yes? In recent years, calls for increased science literacy have received additional fuel, motivated by growing concerns about the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories that contradict established scientific findings. Okay, The immediate question I have with this, oh, I should say, this is published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, just for the reference. Here. One of the things, what I immediately have a question on here is what is meant by misinformation in this, as it's the main topic thrust here, that the goal is, let's make folks a little bit more science literate so that they are aware of misinformation and can not be confused by misinformation, right? It seems a noble goal. But the question would be, what do you mean by misinformation? And let me put it two different ways. What do you mean in terms of how you define it? And what do you mean in practice? Because, or in praxis, if you will. What do you mean by that? When you're engineering, not engineering, when you're talking about increasing science literacy? Very fair question to ask to get started. And so we're on the same page. What do you mean by misinformation? So it's just a point of note here that I'm presuming they have a definition in mind. I do not know off the top of my head what their definition is. In here, generally my understanding is misinformation is regarded to be incorrect information or something that is false, essentially. And as opposed to the other kind of things, the way I understand it with misinformation is that it's false, but it's not intentionally so. It's not like intentional malicious manipulation. Let's put it that way. Here, but the other type is disinformation, which is considered to be intentional falsehoods, is my understanding of those two terms. So may correct me if I'm wrong. But the question that I have is, it might be unintentional or intentional falsehoods, but again, what do you mean by that in practice? And it strikes me as interesting because of some of the other things that they get into in here, particularly with the cognitive side of it. That is what makes me ask the question. What is meant here? Are we being careful about this in terms of the definitions? Again, not an ill towards them necessarily, but it is a question that I have when I read this. It's like, what is the definition on paper, and what is the definition in practice? Two different things. Quite possibly two different things. This context prompted the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to conduct a consensus study in 2016, culminating in the report Science Literacy, Concepts, Context, and Consequence, which highlighted the major gaps remaining in science literacy scholarship. I don't know why it's called a consensus study here, to be honest. It would seem more like a review, because that would seem like a review article to me, or a review report, if you will, considering this comes from the National Academies of Sciences, and it's not a peer-reviewed article necessarily, although they do have internal reviews that they do in those kinds of situations with those things. So let's continue there. I'm just pointing that out, that one I'm not familiar with in terms of terminology. Normally I would just call that a review paper. Science literacy broadly refers to, quote, familiarity with the enterprise and practice of science. So that's according to that report that they cited. So familiarity with the enterprise and practice of science. Again, I would ask for some more details on what that is. I would assume it was in that report, so I'm not necessarily going to knock on that one. So that's the question that I have, of course, is, familiarity with the enterprise and practice of science. Okay, is the definition we're going through. Although there is widespread agreement that a science-literate citizenry should be the norm in modern democracies, scholars have yet to clearly articulate what it concretely means to be science-literate in the 21st century. In other words, what skills should a science-literate individual master, and for what end? How can these skills stay relevant in ever-changing science and media environments? As a result, we have little understanding of how science literacy would help people be informed about science and protect themselves against misinformation, nor what kind of skills science literacy would have to include to do so. Okay, so that's fascinating in and of itself. And you're considering it, and what we're talking about here is, this is not the same landscape for communicating information that it was 20 years ago, where it would be on the TV or just in a newspaper, or you'd hear it on the radio. No, you have it instantly at your fingertips with your smartphone if you're on Twitter or Facebook or TikTok or Getter or any of the different social media platforms. There's a massive number of them now. Locals, another example. where you're sharing information with each other instantly. So it is a very relevant question to ask, actually, here. And this is not, I will point out, this is not a research paper in the sense, this is more of a commentary than anything, here, though certainly interesting, in here. And I appreciate that my locals members voted for this one, because this was a good read for me. In this report, we address 3 larger questions to outline what it should mean to be science literate in today's world. How should we conceptualize science literacy? How can we achieve this science literacy? And what can we expect science literacy's most important outcomes to be? Let's see. On complex scientific issues, it has to encompass... Wait a second. If science literacy is to truly enable people to become and stay informed and avoid being misinformed, on complex science issues, it has to encompass knowledge and skills that go beyond understanding what we traditionally think of as the world of science. So, what do we traditionally think of? You're not giving me a benchmark of where to start. It's just a point of thing. I mean, what do I traditionally think of when I think of science? I think of science as the process by which we answer questions in the pursuit of the truth. The world of science being, but then again, I know more than most of the public, being a scientist by profession myself. So yeah, I mean, I read that and was like, huh? What do we traditionally think of? And also the question that goes parallel to that as I'm reading my notes again, what do people already know in that kind of vein about how science is done, which institutions are involved, and all this other kind of stuff? What do people already know is a fair question we need to ask ourselves if we're talking about a more science literate citizenry, if you will. That is a fair question to also ask. Then is, okay, what is the benchmark with which we are starting with? But this is about defining what it means to be science literate. So let us continue. However, many challenges for how this 21st century science literacy can be achieved in an equitable way among the American public, and we take a structural perspective to examine some of the ways we could accomplish this. In particular, we focus on digital divides as a structural barrier and discuss how realistic our vision of a science-literate America really is. We see some promise in community literacy, which we believe constitutes a structural opportunity to achieve an ambitious goal. I'm not sure what your ambitious goal is off the top of my head here, but that's... Oh, I missed it if there was one stated already. Let's put it that way. Which wouldn't surprise me, so it's fair to point that one out. We also see potential to build science literacy lessons into media and science communication. We end our report by returning to the question posed in the title, misinformed about what? We describe how science literacy, as we've outlined it, could address the different ways people tend to be misinformed across science-related issues. We discuss not only what greater science literacy among the American public could accomplish, but, as importantly, what greater science literacy will likely not accomplish. Well, that's good. If you're putting forward your definition of science literacy and you're saying to me, okay, we should do this because we think it'll do this, this, and this, that's great. I appreciate that. That gives me a benchmark of things to critique and talk about it. Think about some of the ideas that are there. But yeah, it's okay. Achieve a certain level of science literacy, achieve this vision of what you call science literate, and yeah, okay. And you point out the things that you think will be good about it. The question, of course, is how do you know what is success like? How do you know it'll work? That's a whole other kind of thing. Let's see. Modern science-related issues such as COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, vaccinations, gene editing, and artificial intelligence are complex and dynamic with profound implications for individuals, communities, and societies. Extremely so. Extremely so with that one. Let's see. People will pay attention to some information and will interpret it. Okay. Much of the science of these issues moves rapidly through information environments rife with incorrect, confusing, and quickly changing information. People will pay attention to some of this information and will interpret it based on their values while discarding others based on complex cognitive processes. Depending on all of these factors, individuals may or may not become polarized on these issues as they develop in society. Okay. Let's see. People should feel equipped to access and use trustworthy science-related information when needed for informed decision-making, both in their everyday lives and as citizens. They also need to be able to gain additional skills to navigate misinformation and potentially highly polarized or contentious opinions across different issues and information sources. Okay. What I remind here is trustworthy science. There is a difference between having trust in science and having trust in scientists. Those things are not, science and scientist is not necessarily mutually stuck together as having trust in one, you will automatically have trust in the other. There was a great, oh goodness, I think it was Nathan Kofnas, actually, who published a paper on this some years ago, where he talked about that in terms of, it was either Kofnas or Gauchat, I can't remember which, off the top of my head, but it was a fascinating piece looking at the difference between trusting science and trusting scientists and discussing that in depth. Because you can trust that science, the process, is a good thing and works well. You can also think in the same breath that the scientists in question are not implementing it well, and you think their results are crap because of it. Conversely, you could think that, okay, the science as a process is a piece of garbage, but these scientists over here are doing it perhaps in a better way, and therefore I trust them over there. Those things are kind of thing. Although I could see it from the scientific method kind of thing. Generally they can go together, but they don't have to be together all the time. Let's put it that way. And it was a great piece that was published some years ago. And so, trustworthy science-related information. Okay, here's kind of question. For one thing, what do you define as trustworthy? But also, who is it that you're trusting in this? Are you trusting that the process of science was followed correctly, or are you trusting that the scientist has high amounts of integrity? That's another study. That was, again, either Gauchat or Golfnos. The two of them I'm getting confused. But the study in question, the other study in question, not the one I was just talking about trust in science versus trust in scientists, the thing here that is fascinating with that is the idea that there was one particular study, I can't remember who the author was. I get the two of them confused, but who the authors were, lead author anyway. But this one looked at three particular things about the scientist in question as to whether or not the public would trust that person who was delivering. They talked about whether or not it was in a consensus, whether or not it seemed like somebody understood what they were doing, and whether or not they felt the person in question had integrity. And probably, if I remember correctly with that study, the chief factor that determined trustworthiness for this group was the integrity. If you thought somebody who was delivering the message had a certain amount of integrity. So that's another question in this is, how do you define trustworthy? And it's a fair one to ask. Again, I've already asked this question a few times, so I'm wondering, what is misinformation here? And, that is a fair question to ask. Of course, the schematic cycle we described does not take into account all the complexities of science knowledge production and popularization and the potential mutual influences between the different dimensions presented in the figure. So there's a figure down here of what they think is the important stuff of science literacy, science production being over here, people, institutions, resources, process, norms, and goals. Media and online information production is the media section here, people, institution, resources, process, norms, goals, and technologies. And then over here is the opinion formation, the cognitive side of it, beliefs, heuristics, emotion, and motivations, where it gets into your head as you're reading it here. So that's interesting. Let's see. Understanding how science isn't produced. Science is the process by which we produce knowledge. Science isn't produced. Note to self right there. Produce knowledge and get at the truth about particular questions of interest. Let me continue. So, civic science literacy, the first stage of science information life cycle, relates to the production of scientific knowledge and the creation of scientific facts. That's interesting. I just would have left it at production of scientific knowledge, but that's just me. An understanding of that is captured in civic science literacy. Okay. Let's see. So they have a conceptualization of civic science literacy that has to do with skills. It was originally proposed as skills necessary to understand and evaluate main points behind arguments in policy disputes involving science and technology, which included things like mastering vocabulary, understanding the process of science, some understanding of science and technology's impacts on individuals and society. Here, let's see. Too narrow, but the critique of that was too narrowly focused on science's impacts on society without including how the contextual impacts of society on science, which is not an unfair concern. We talked about this with respect in history before, and for example, what the USSR, how badly the USSR screwed up science in the USSR, and that was a societal thing. So that is not unheard of, and not unrealistic necessarily, I don't think, to consider. As a result, the original concept of science literacy, civic science literacy, I should say, missed how interactions between science and society shape the type of science research that is conducted, who supports it, and the potential implications of its applications. Yes, so I don't necessarily disagree with that. I don't actually disagree with that particular thing. That is pretty fair to say that there is a certain amount of interaction between science and society. Why? Because, for example, in the US, a lot of universities get their grant dollars from the federal government, and so whatever science the federal government wants to fund is what gets the grant dollars at this point. So it's like there is that. There is actually a line. I talked about this in another video. There is a line in the Constitution which says that Congress shall fund science effectively. So it's there, part of the budgets. It's a Congress shall do this. It's not a Congress cannot do this. Or Congress has leeway to say no. They actually do have to fund scientific science fund things to the progress of science, I believe is the proper phrasing in the Constitution. But that is there. And to that degree, though, it does not prescribe in the Constitution, because they couldn't have possibly known at the time they were writing it what types of science get funded, what specific research is important, or any kind of that jazz in there. So there is that. The understanding of scientific processes and conceptualizations of science started to do some work toward measuring the extent to which those literacy skills are attained or not by Americans. Very little work tests how these skills actually work. Okay. We therefore argue that civic science literacy should go beyond the extent conceptualizations, and should also capture the elements that shape science and how science fits into society. Okay. This leads to a question, because that might actually be very philosophical in how different people view the world, and not necessarily a solid singular fact. That might actually be more related to someone's worldview. So I don't necessarily agree that this is a good point. And why? Because for me, of course, the telos of science, the ultimate purpose of science, is the pursuit of the truth via evidence and reason and what have you, for things that it can use evidence particularly for. However, what is the role of science in society? That is a deeply philosophical question, which is very much connected to how science fits into society. It's almost effectively the same question. What is the role of science in society? If you're talking about scientific literacy with respect to informed or misinformed, then are you saying that factually you know what the role of science is? And therefore, anything else is misinformation with respect to that part. That's my question here. Because to me, the role of science when it comes to society is as the arbiter of truth as much as it can be with respect to physical processes, because of its primary purpose and function as being the pursuit of the truth. It is not to do anything with respect to supporting one particular narrative or another. If the findings of the scientific process end up supporting one particular narrative or another, well, hey, what the heck? But its primary purpose is the pursuit of the truth. And as such, it can end up being the arbiter of the truth in society. But that may not be what other people think. Other people could argue, well, it's the job of science to help solve all these different problems plaguing society. Well, if you're talking about the pursuit of the truth may involve something that's not a problem plaguing society at the moment. So that's a whole other kind of thing. What is the role of science in society? Maybe more philosophical than something that is solidly grounded in fact. So that's why I don't know that that's necessarily an appropriate thing to jump into the science literacy kind of thing as much as a philosophical discussion with somebody. I could be swayed either way on that one. It is also clear that individuals cannot be expected to follow current mediated discussions about scientific issues without understanding some of the nitty-gritty aspects of modern science. Why? Why is that clear? I would... Many aspects of science that are seldom included in formal education of individuals who are not pursuing scientific fields do appear very often in public discourse. For example, individuals pertaining and other science issues should have broad understanding of the following topics: the incremental production of scientific knowledge and why one single study can seldom uncover the mechanisms behind one phenomenon. Okay. From that aspect, I could see some of those things being there, but that kind of thing doesn't necessarily translate into needing to know, not that I don't want folks to know, that's not the issue, into needing to know about all the different institutions that do these things and which universities and which agencies and all this other kind of stuff. That doesn't necessarily translate into that to me. So that's a whole other kind of thing. Anywhoozle. Let's see. The incremental production of scientific knowledge and why a single okay, yeah. Including, yeah, okay. Well, there's a lot of these things that I actually have done a fair bit of this on this channel and in my locals community. So, hey, I can understand the interest in that. Really, I can. Let's see. Societal factors such as economics, politics, social priorities, and other societal elements shape who is doing science in what areas at any given point, just as the information and technology that comes out of science shape the choices and decisions we face in society. And at the same time, there's actually many studies done that have nothing to do with scientific societal interest. And I can give you a sense of what that is immediately off the top of my head by way of example. You may be funded to do a particular project, but what may happen is that you find something else that is not relevant to the original thing, and you may have been funded off of dollars that are not tied to any particular research grant, having the capacity to look into a question that is of your own musing, or of somebody else's musing, perhaps, and you end up finding something there that may or may not be of societal interest. It is not necessarily so, therefore, that every question that is asked and answered in research and what have you, or approached in scientific research, is entirely driven by societal priorities, or politics, or economics. Can be, but it is not entirely true that it is all the time. I don't think. Let's put it that. Not all the time. Predominantly, probably, but not all the time. If only because, like I said, federal government funds science. Here, there's a lot of universities and professors that work off of federal grant dollars, and so what the federal government wants to pay for is what often gets funded in research. at least for the United States. Anyway, individuals need to be able to understand what science can tell us. Okay, wait a second. Civic science literacy dimensions of greater science literacy then should mean individuals are aware to a degree of these processes. Most interesting from our perspective, especially in the context of addressing misinformation, is that knowing these elements and relationships that shape what makes something scientific, why the quotes, will also mean knowing what is not scientific. Again, why the quotes. In other words, individuals need to be able to answer what science can tell us and what kind of questions it can answer. Yeah, actually, that is entirely fair. Because science, of course, is not scientism. Scientism is the rational, well, not, well, to me it's irrational, let's put it that way. It's the belief that science can answer all questions, even the moral ones, which it cannot do. Purely by the design of the scientific method, it is very hard to do that. The nature of media environments, mainly online today, shape what information people can what people can access, how they see it, and what conclusions they may then draw from it. Yeah. And I would particularly add social media. Like I said, instant information, social media. Science literacy has to include being able to navigate and evaluate mediated science information. Indeed. If you're watching me on YouTube right now, I'm mediating science information for you. You got to be able to navigate it according to science literacy, and I would actually very much agree with that right now, because there's a lot of stuff online that is crap. There is a lot of stuff online that is utter crap. So I can totally agree with that sentiment. Let's see. So they actually include, they go through this whole section here. I'm going to skip over a little bit of this here, but they include in this whole section the difference between media literacy and digital literacy being two different things, because digital literacy refers to participating through society, in society through opportunities enabled by digital technology, which is internet, personal computers, smartphones, the whole likes like that. Media literacy is more solely about the ability to access, understand, and assess media and media content, and the ability to create content. So there's that. They smash the two of them together because they kind of do recognize that at this point, most everything in media is digital. At this point, you're going on YouTube, you're on Netflix streaming, you might be streaming a news show, be it Fox or CNN or whatever, through a streaming TV or something like that. And vast majority of it is digital at this point. So that is, I think, fair to make that leap. How people and institutions create that information with particular norms and goals, and how digital technologies shape what information appears and how. Because of how these factors interact, digital media science literacy will likely need to include at least 3 skill areas: the ability to access science information, particularly in online environments, an understanding of how science information travels through media systems, particularly online, and the ability to evaluate individual pieces of science information in media messages, based as well on the skills captured in the civic science literacy dimension. Okay, I could see some of that. That's certainly interesting. Much of the research on media literacy. Okay. Excuse me. Oh, I meant to ask here with this, why would this not include the ability to find the source material and how to read it? Because everything is mediated, why not actually be able to get a hold of the source material and read said source material yourself? And include that in scientific literacy. I think that would actually be quite a useful thing to do. But such is. Elements that could be examined as components of digital media science literacy could include the following. First, how journalists, social media companies, and others produce media content and media technologies, and for what purposes. This includes who creates and disseminates science-related information, why, how trustworthy they are. Again, define what you mean by trustworthy. What science information does the information producer highlight and what might be missing? How media produce science headlines, there we go, and the extent to which the headline matches the content of the story. What are science facts versus opinions in media stories, and why individuals share science stories or piece of information on social media? Second, are the features and limitations of the online search, which includes 1, what is the original source of the so you're talking about how to get the original source of the information. Okay, good for me. Or who wrote or produced it? How could one find additional information to add context and additional perspectives? How might the terms in the article shape what appears and what does not appear in search engine results when searching for more information? And how could one find more general words to use in a search to get a possibly less narrow search result? Actually, I think you could test this one pretty quickly. This thing about the search engine, you can actually test that pretty quickly because you just got to get a hold of a search engine optimization algorithm, or or stick with a particular search engine, and ask about their search engine optimization algorithm, stick with that particular search engine, for example, and do a test with it and see what kind of articles show up as related to the words. Particularly Google Scholar or something like that. You could go that way. Anywho, that is some of my thoughts there. Let's see. Well, that would certainly be interesting. I am all for actually people being able to search whatever they would like. I would actually, like I said, love to see people just start reading articles, science articles, particularly because under the normative principle communality, or more articles are becoming open access and more journals are going open access, which means anybody out in the world can access a scientific journal article. If you are going into any journal that publishes open access is available to everybody. So that I would love to see. Anyway, okay. Individuals need some level of cognitive science literacy as well, or an awareness of their own biases as they evaluate science information and media. Okay. Let's see. Awareness of one's own processes for thinking through information and how these processes shape resulting conclusions. The assumption is that if one understands those processes are at work, one will be more likely to and be able to regulate them. Making sure you can assess what they are is the bigger thing. First, you got to figure out what they are correctly. Cognitive literacy can also facilitate information searching and can improve critical thinking and reading. More importantly, cognitive literacy appears to be a skill that can be developed in adulthood. It is well established that having access to reliable sources of science information does not mean that information will be critically evaluated. I'm going to ask a fun question here. What is meant by critically? Because if it's the postmodernist version of critically, then I'm not terribly interested there. But if it's the Enlightenment kind of version of critically evaluating something, then yeah, I would agree with that sentiment. So this is, again, what are definitions? Definitions on paper, definitions in practice. That would be my question. Let's see. In the context of controversial science such as fracking and genetic engineering, having more information about these issues may just mean the individual is more extreme in their opinions. It may not. You could also say that of a COVID-19 pandemic or climate change right now. So, let's see. Directional motivated reasoning, in which we all pay attention to and give more weight to information that is congruent to our beliefs and are more critical of information that seems incompatible with them. We are motivated to save time and use heuristics or mental shortcuts that help us quickly reach conclusions on complex issues. Yeah, heuristics themselves are not necessarily bad in a lot of cases, but you got to make sure that the assumptions of those heuristics are correct, which there can be many times when they are not. There can be many, many, many times when they're not, and that particularly when it comes to any heuristics. Well, they can be with any heuristic, really. Yeah, that's the best way to put it. What I'm thinking. But heuristics can be extremely useful. Let's see. Research suggests that people are generally capable of practicing epistemic vigilance or being on guard for misinformation from others. Again, define misinformation. And the reason I ask about this is because misinformation generally is, like I said, something that is false. Okay. Then you got to have a definition for what do you mean by the truth, right? In the rational kind of sense, you can get it from logic and reason. When you're talking about science, you're talking about evidence. A lot of times, you can use logic and reason in there too, but you're talking about evidence most of the time. But if you go at it from a postmodernist perspective, which believes all knowledge and truth is generated by those in power, essentially, then essentially anything that comes from those who do not share that belief is false, even though whomever doesn't share the belief about what is true coming from those in power or coming from a postmodernist framework, um, yeah, there suddenly is a conflict there where misinformation is not what you think it is. Um, Misinformation is not false information, if you will. It is whatever the person who doesn't like your information disagrees with you about. Here, if a person disagrees with you, you're spreading misinformation. That is the way it can be taken in a postmodernist sense. I'm not saying that's what's being said here, though I'm partially suspicious because of the word equity showing up before, and equitable, I should say, and equity does have a tendency in practice to mean equality of outcomes, which is the more postmodernist view of things, and hence the reason. So that's why I'm continuing to ask, what do you mean on paper versus in practice? Because if it is in the in practice sense of it's misinformation because of because of these because it doesn't align with postmodernist thought and worldview, then that's not really misinformation just as much as it's more so just something that's not wanting to be heard. That's why I'm asking the question about definitions here. This is, generally speaking, a fairly good article and fairly good read as I've been reading it, but that is the question that I have, is what do you mean by some of these definitions? And what do you mean on paper versus what do you mean in practice when you're actually working with those definitions in your day-to-day, or even in the writing of this paper? That's a fair question I would ask. Let's see. Can safely assume, based on the body of work regarding cognitive literacy, that greater cognitive literacy could help people better navigate and use information on science-related issues in society. So be aware of what's going on in your own head. And actually, yeah, I generally do agree with the notion that being self-reflective of kinds of things where you make mistakes, or you might be biased to think in one way or another, is an okay thing. Let's see. Emotions shape our reasoning in predictable ways, such as becoming overly certain when we are angry, which can make a hasty conclusions. Yeah, this is why you don't rush into doing something when you're emotional about something. Really, it's generally not a good idea. Okay. For example, addressing. Okay. Okay, so generally what they're arguing for there for greater scientific literacy is greater cognitive scientific literacy is helping people be aware of their own biases. So I'm not going to belabor the point in that section any longer. So how could we achieve greater scientific literacy? Focused on highlighting some promising concepts and research directions that could enhance our theoretical understanding of these dimensions as they matter for being informed about science issues. The critical question remains, however, on how to actually achieve this greater science literacy in the American society, and if it is even attainable. Very fair question. Can adults realistically gain the skills necessary to become science literate in the United States nowadays and be better equipped to navigate online discussions of science? If the answer is yes, and we believe it is, then how? Okay. Science education among students in formal education programs is promising, and we are seeing successes in developing skills in digital media literacy in particular. Okay. Just make sure we check on what that's about, because that's K through 12. I might forward that one over to the Reason We Learn and see if she knows a bit about that one, because that one actually I do not know quite much about and what's being done on that regard with respect to science literacy in K through 12 schools. So that would be something to look into. This work is highlighting the importance of cognitive literacy for critical thinking and for developing the ability to find and navigate information online. Yeah, okay. Okay. Enhancing the different dimensions of science literacy in adults outside formal education settings will be more challenging, and a result in that context is less developed. What is clear is that for both children and adults in the United States, achieving science literacy will not be possible without taking a structural view of literacy. Why? Why will it not be possible? That's a very fair question. If you're gonna say it's not possible without that, I'm gonna ask you why not. Anyway, a structural view of science literacy focuses on how structures shape the distribution of literacies and differences in opportunity. Okay, I get the feeling we're going in a very postmodernist direction right now, because that is kind of postmodernist worldview, that there is a structure and hierarchy to society, and some people, whomever constructs everything in dominant fashion and what have you, and everybody else has to deal with it, kind of thing. Anywho, addressing digital divides, building literacy content across information sources, and better understanding community literacy. Disparities in society shape who is science literate and not, or not, and digital divides, representing who has access to online tools and information, are one of the many ways these disparities play out. Those who are white, male, wealthy, and well-educated in the United States are more likely to create online content and to be able to access and benefit from online technologies and information. How old are those studies where they point that out? Because, I mean, just like, I think of all the content creators on YouTube that are doing science-related stuff at this point, or even just doing content at all on YouTube, because they're just talking about creating online content here. And to be honest, I don't know a whole lot of them that are white men. But then again, that's anecdotal information, so that's why I'm kind of curious. 2018 is number 41. Also 2018 is number 50. Interesting. Okay. Just pointing that one out myself. Anyway. Oh, shoot. I'm on the wrong page here. Let's see. Even when people have physical access to online resources, those who are already advantaged in society have different levels of access to and different patterns across use of most online information platforms, and often gain the most from informational resources. Goodness. For example, digital divides exist in who seeks out news versus entertainment, who seeks out the different types of entertainment, who seeks out different types of entertainment. Digital divides exist in whether some or not someone is likely to have offline and online social networks they are interested in, or that they identify with science. Digital divides also impact what terms people are likely to use as keywords when using search engines, and therefore what information they are likely to come across as a result. All of these divides occur along socioeconomic, racial, and other demographic lines in the United States, and all translates into barriers in gaining science literacy. Digital divides, in that sense, like many other areas of systemic inequity, breed further inequity. And because literacy also begets literacy, inequities in literacy will beget greater inequities in literacy unless we work to ensure that opportunities for literacy are equitable and based on where a person is in terms of what they have access to and want to achieve. Achieving science literacy, therefore, requires continued research on how to overcome the digital divide that affects whether people are able to develop and use literacy skills. Okay. So I'm going to say it right there. That is a postmodernist kind of argument in here, I do believe, with the idea of the systemic part of it, for sure. Very, very light, if you will, on it, but it's still very much there. In the notion that you're disadvantaged. I'm presuming here the notion is that you are disadvantaged from having access to online information by your barriers in society, if you will, or whatever privileged or marginalized, however it would be in this particular instance. And yet at the same time, they also fully admit in this section, fully saying in this section, for example, digital divides exist in who seeks out news versus entertainment. That would just be called personal choice. And it is fair to say that not all people have an interest in science. Not all people have an interest in science, and therefore, here's the other thing. If not all people have an interest in science, why should we expect those people to want to become science literate? Doesn't mean we don't think it's a good thing that they become science literate. That's not what I'm saying. Why would we expect people to want to become science literate? Therefore, I would also say, how then do you expect the outcome to be entirely equal across all groups? Because we're talking about equitable, right? equitable opportunities for literacy are equitable and based on where a person is in terms of what they have access to and what they want to achieve. Equitable tends to refer to equal outcomes in the postmodernist kind of frame of this. And that's not necessarily what you can get if people don't want to be scientifically literate for whatever reason. And one of those reasons might be culture, to be honest. Could very easily be culture. Some cultures value getting knowledge more than others, and that's just that doesn't say anything ill of that culture. That's just something that might be a case if that's the values kind of thing. And so I do wonder, how do you get to equal outcome when people don't necessarily want to be science literate? If people don't want that, like I said, I'm not saying an ill either way. I'm just noticing an observation of cultures in history. Not all of them want to go after said knowledge or literacy in something because it's not something that may not be something that they value or see value in. That's not an ill of them. Something that is, more or less. But that does mean you can't necessarily get to let's see, equal literacy. Now, to be fair to them, they are arguing for opportunities for literacy are equitable, and that is a different thing. But here, that is one thing I want to point out, though, is that having equal opportunities, which is a good thing. I do think actually you should have an equal opportunity to have science literate information, what have you, is not the same as having equal outcomes. You will not likely never have equal outcomes on science literacy because there will always be people who do not value science and therefore would have no reason, desire to be literate in science or in scientific process or anything like that. So that's just something I'm pointing out here, that there is the variable of choice here for whatever reason, that somebody just may not want to be science literate. Should we absolutely provide equal opportunities? Heck yes. Heck yes. Heck yes. But if you don't want it, me providing you the equal opportunity for it doesn't mean you're going to become science literate overnight. Or even ever at all. Let's see. I'm running out of time here. Usually I try to keep these to an hour, but I may run long tonight because I was running my mouth on a few things. Oh, goodness. Let's see. So let's see. Literacy through the media. So by using media for increasing science literacy, we do not mean using fact checks or warnings or information. And more importantly, fact checkers are only successful when people trust the fact check source. Additionally, fact checks do not help people gain the skills they need to evaluate science information and for themselves. It may, in many information settings where fact checkers do not exist. There's a fair number of lawsuits against Facebook right now, I think, for the things of biased fact checkers, if I recall correctly. I think there's a few. Yeah, actually, I think John Stossel is suing Facebook or one of the fact checking companies that Facebook was using anyway. For that reason. Let's see. Applied science communication training for scientists and journalists could encourage them to include science literacy aspects in their stories. Design features on social media sites could also include some of these elements. The idea would be that when people access science information, they are also accessing science literacy increasing information. So a little bit more, would seem a little bit more media manipulation, but anyway. Let's see. Science producer stage. So these are research questions they would ask. A lot of them are interesting. I'm just trying to make sure that I don't dwell too much on that right now, because I do think some of the questions are really, really interesting. So in here, although I would point out with the media side of things, like, can components of digital media literacy dimension be included in media stories? What happens at the audience level? Problem with that is media companies do have to make money themselves. Right? So is this going to take away from them making money? Is going to be one of the reasons why should we or shouldn't we include this thing, when you're talking about news stories in particular. So that's just it there. Um, Rather than just corrections or fact checking, can social media sites provide science literacy information? What would that look like? Yeah, I would. I don't know that that would go over well, and that would improve the. I think some of the goals here are improving the support of science in the scientific community right now, which I appreciate. I don't know that it would go over very well to do this with social media companies, given that there is at least the very strong belief, if not some evidence to support it, that social media companies are openly censoring people that they disagree with. This is generally a perception amongst conservative audiences, and so you would not necessarily increase the support of science to have social media companies doing science literacy information because of that particular perception right now. But that's an observation on my part. Let's see. Oh, yeah, community literacy thing. Community literacy refers to how the shared literacy in a social network or community is greater than the aggregate literacy of each person in a network taken into account individually. Let's see. Is greater literacy for individuals the sole goal, or should we think of community science literacy as well? Okay. Certain community members hold more of a particular type of knowledge, or literacy skills to gain more information on a specific science topic. Indeed, they may very well, and they may very well by choice, for that matter. Let's see. The idea of community literacy raises interesting questions about achieving literacy for adults that need to be pondered and addressed in scholarly work. Some of these questions include: in what ways would community literacy compensate for lower levels of literacy in individuals in the community? What baseline level of literacy would be needed for individuals, and how would literacy skills be distributed? These are really kind of interesting research questions, actually, from my perspective. So, I'd be curious to see what the results end up being if you do end up researching this and how you would research it. Be fascinating for me, actually. I'm kind of like, ooh, this would be fun. Then, given how we answer the questions above, in what case, okay. In short, these questions could be summed up the following way. To what extent do individuals need to be science literate themselves, and to what extent could they instead combine forces with their friends, neighbors, and influencers in their community? Okay, so yeah, that's the question about the individual versus that. The interesting challenge, I think, with the community literacy kind of thing would be, what if people move? Because people do move. We don't always stay in the same place. People who move around this country a lot, particularly in the last couple of years, like fleeing different parts of the country for other parts of the country. So that would be another kind of thing I would think of. Anywho, what does success look like? This is the question that I'm after. It's just like, what are you looking for? What is your end goal in this? In your kind of, if you can get this vision of science literacy to work, what is your measure of success in that? That's kind of what I want to know. In here with this one, so I'm glad this section's in here. Put forth that science literacy is best seen as skill building that can help people navigate diverse science-related issues across the science information life cycle to avoid misinformation to make informed decisions at the individual and collective levels. Beyond misinformation, we then describe some of the limits of decision. Okay. Let's see here. Misinformed about what? Better understanding of potential bounds of science. Interesting. Many misinformation examples put forward by scientists seem to involve overestimating the power of science, whether by misunderstanding the power of one scientific study or set of studies, or misunderstanding the ability of science in general to answer our most pressing questions. Yes. The way I like to describe it with science is we stand on the shoulders of giants. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Here. And so it does take many, many, many studies to reach something that is the theory, is at the theory level and is generally accepted by the whole community until something comes along to disprove it. And then the whole process starts again, where we're going more for more studies. Oh, this theory doesn't work after we've had more studies there. I think it was Einstein that said no one study can prove me right, but it can prove my theory right, but any one study can prove it wrong. Was the kind of I'm misquoting him. I know I'm not quoting it exactly right, but there's something to that sentiment, and that's what that comes from there. So misinformed about what answer a scientific study or selection of studies answers includes could be particularly useful for better assessing information, such as how norms and practices in science and scientific institutions shape what a single study stands for and what does it mean when a study is retracted. Understanding. I may do a whole other video on just talking about the topic of what is a retraction, really. But that is something I know most folks don't necessarily understand there, so I'd agree with that. Civic science literacy skills could mean people can better discern when misinformation portrays science information as more uncertain than it actually is, or cherry picks information. Digital media science, okay. In many cases, however, misinformation also arises when there's not yet a clear right answer for a scientific question. Yeah, you had that quite a lot, and there's also a lot of concern with respect to the process of science in general, where you end up refining things quite frequently, and if it's happening rapidly, that is a concern. Fast produced science, okay. Here, literacy science literacy could help people better understand why complex uncertainty exists in science and what scientists are doing to better address the uncertainty. Okay. In addition to helping people identify misinformation, such literacy skills could perhaps also make misinformation providing false, short-lived uncertainty less appealing. Okay. I don't necessarily, I don't actually disagree with talking about some of these issues of how science is constructed. And part of the reason I don't disagree with that is because K through 12 does a damn bad job, actually, at helping to understand some of these basics of science. And I don't think it's necessarily even taught well in undergraduate curriculum either. So that's point that I want to make there. Finally, in many cases, misinformation arises from conflict between diverse and value-laden viewpoints and concerns. Yeah, this is a good thing here to get at with the science of what can answer, because I mean, this is, like I've said many times, science is a process, gets at the truth. It never gives you a moral compass, what you do with it, and that's what they're talking about here actually with some of that idea. So I appreciate this section quite much, because you get into those kinds of discussions of what's the limits of what science can do, and people need to recognize that. Though that might be a philosophical argument also, because someone who is more versed in scientism, where it is believed that science can even answer the moral questions, may very well disagree with the notions here of scientific literacy. So that is a point to be taken, that there might be a little bit of a philosophical push back and forth there. However, while science literacy will be vital for reducing the impact of misinformation, science literacy cannot be a magic wand that reduces all of our societal disagreements and confusion about science issues. Exactly. Science literacy can't do that. Tempting to hope, especially when faced with people who disagree with us, that science literacy will lead to support for a particular normative claim or societal path. As scientific processes themselves illustrate, disagreement paired with collaboration is necessary to advancement. Yes, and key to scientific advancement, key to the pursuit of the truth, is viewpoint diversity. You have to be able to have viewpoint diversity, which is why, again, I go back to, what are you defining as misinformation, and what are you defining it on paper versus how are you practicing it in what you mean? Because those are things that are of concern to me when you're talking about viewpoint diversity. Making sure that we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about misinformation here in particular, right? Could lead to greater skepticism. Actually, I would say in some ways this has been shown already, because at least with respect to surveys of people regarding climate change, there are significant numbers of people who actually are more I don't like the word disbelief, because climate change is not a religious thing. but that's the best way I can say it, is that they don't agree with the conclusions of scientific studies thus far, um, and they tend to be more educated. And admittedly, right there, I'm using education as a proxy for literacy. But I do believe there was also a study that looked at the narrow definition of scientific literacy there and found that folks who were more scientifically literate, um, if they were, yes, there was a significant number of folks who were more. I'm trying to remember the exact thing, and it was so many years ago when I read that. But I think in some studies that may have already been demonstrated. So that's one thing. Let's see. Digital literacy research tends to focus on empowerment and equity. How to ensure that digital technologies and opportunities do not further inequities in economic and social opportunities. Considering that equity in praxis usually means equality of outcome, this is where I get concerned about this being quite postmodernist. Anyway, science literacy, however, usually hasn't explicitly focused on equity or skepticism intended in a way to reduce controversies. Okay, let's see. Here they are talking about the issue here with knowledge-wise, where you might get greater relativism for a while, where you think nobody has the truth, really. No, you don't trust anybody, is what they're arguing. And that they're arguing that in greater scientific literacy, you may ultimately step through the problem of the naivete of, not naivety, well, they might step through the absolutist thing of truth is known and then advance to the relativistic idea that the chaotic absolute opposite, where you can't really know anything, and then finally to the more sophisticated, nuanced belief regarding there is a reality that we can all share and that we all share and can know, which is objective truth, if you will, which is certainly interesting. It's kind of on the fence of whether or not there's a decent amount of postmodernist influence in here. I would say that there is, but you're also talking about the objective truth at the same time. So, and generally speaking, postmodernists have a very loose relationship and sometimes outright hostility to objective reality. Anyway, we are almost finished here, and I would like to make sure we get wrapped up so I can give you my final thoughts. Let's see. Let's see. Ultimately, however, greater scientific literacy, as we have outlined in this article, could still end up furthering the original goal of science literacy, generating more support for science. But support for science, by support for science, it is important to note that we mean epistemic support, seeing science as a legitimate form of understanding the world, at least as an ideal, even if not perfect in practice. This kind of support aligns with the concepts of belief in the authority of in the authority science. In the authority science? I think you mean authority of science, but I'm not sure. And the cultural authority of science. These refer to how individuals and cultures grant authority to science as a distinct and valuable way of collecting knowledge. Understanding and believing in the value of what scientific processes and therefore scientific information can offer us in particular decision-making contexts could mean that people value and defer to science in situations in which science can offer useful answers. Overclaims of what science can offer could also reduce trust in the value of science and hinder our ability to discuss across diverse viewpoints. It could spur counter reactions in which people rightfully, even if not explicitly, recognize that science does not have the answer to their concerns. It remains an open question, however, if science literacy, as we have outlined, it helps better navigate issues that are not only scientifically but also ethically and socially complex, and what that means for their views on the issues of science more broadly. All right, I am going to close up there with one thing. I am always hesitant with the idea of believing in the authority of science. I've talked about it here before that sometimes studies get done, they get through peer review, they get published, and they have the veneer of authority that comes with peer review because they've made it through the scientific process. That's not to say that peer review is bad. It's not. It is a good process, but that doesn't mean it's a perfect process either. Nothing created by humans ends up being perfect. But the thing about that then is because we as a society have placed science and scientists and experts, if you will, on the pedestal. When it comes out of peer review, it's often considered to be authoritative, even if you or someone else might read that study and realize that it is not really, or it has particular problems with it that didn't get caught in peer review. Sometimes this can lead to retractions, sometimes it doesn't. I've read studies on this channel where I thought they should not have, where I thought perhaps they should not have been published. But the reason I am hesitant with the idea of belief in the authority of science is because absolute power corrupts absolutely. Giving a lot of power and deference to what is a very specialized group of individuals invites the temptation to use that power for awful reasons, or use that power to the good but end up doing things awful because of it. And that is the reason I get very kind of nervous about pushing that science is a be-all end-all authority, when in reality it is one part of the decision-making process. In a lot of the interior agencies, they use something called structured decision-making, whereby they will bring in science information, but they will also have all these objectives they're trying to counterbalance and things like that. And you'll hear from all these different groups and what have you, and it's actually a very analytic method at the very end when you're talking about the probabilities of different things happening and what have you, and the expected value of getting more information instead of just going ahead and making a decision right away, and those kinds of things. So that's what I would be concerned about, is, are we as a society pushing toward putting scientists on a pedestal when maybe that is a pedestal and a power that is not earned? And then you even more run into the issue of, if something happens to break that trust, then suddenly you even have more problems because you've placed placed some people right on a pedestal. That is a concern that I have had for a long time, and I've talked about it, and I don't want someone to come to me to help them. Well, okay, not how I want to put it. I want folks to come to me if they need my help in making a decision. I do not want them to make their decision solely based on what I would have to tell them about anything with respect to climate science, because that, I think, gives me way too much power, and can be head turning, and I don't really want that temptation. So for me, I want to stay focused, because for me as a scientist, it is the prime thing. What is the truth? And the pursuit of the truth is what matters to me a heck of a lot more than power. I don't want to have that temptation. And I think things can go really haywire when you give far too much power to scientists and to experts, rather than dispersing that power amongst different groups of expertise, different groups of stakeholders, and what have you. And indeed, primarily amongst individuals is how that power should be dispersed. Any kind of power should always be decentralized, really. And so that's the concern that I have with putting scientists on a pedestal, and that's where they finish up with it. So, but no, my overall thoughts on the article, I think in general it's a well-written article. I like a lot of the ideas. I see some of the questions and what have you. I obviously do not agree, because I do not share a postmodernist view of the world. I don't agree with some of that, and I do think asking for equal outcomes in terms of science literacy is a bit of a utopic vision, because obviously, if some folks don't value science for whatever reason, then they have no impetus to become scientifically literate. In here, or almost no impetus. They may have impetus for another reason, but for any number of different reasons, be it culture or a personal choice, or I'm just not interested in that, or what have you. You cannot force somebody to be scientifically literate if they do not want to be, which means you can't have equal outcomes or equitable. You can't have equity of literacy if people don't want to be scientifically literate. For any number of different reasons. So that is entirely their choice, and that's nothing against any person with that. If that's the choice of the person, they don't want to learn, they don't have to. That's the thing about it. That's the freedom of choice that we have. I'm totally fine with that. Nothing ill against anybody on that one. But I think this is great. Actually, I applaud the authors. I think this is a great one for starting a discussion. They were actually pretty thorough about including things like with the article, why they think this is important, why they think about this definition versus another definition of scientific literacy, and what have you. And they, what do they think success means? I think for them, the goal of this is like, if you improve scientific literacy, then you'll be generating more support for science. So for them, success would be that if we've got better scientific literacy, then we have more support for science. That's my understanding. And generally speaking, I agree with the notion that if you're pushing for more literacy in science and you get folks more literate in science, there may be more support for doing science. Is one of the reasons I go for the kind of humanity, get to go to like Science by the Glass or something like that, or if there's something like that in the neighborhood where it's like you can just sit down with the scientists and have a beer and talk about what they do and what have you, and learn about some of their topics and things like that. You get to humanize people that way, and I think it's helpful for the trust aspect, because the other thing is that you can make people more literate, as they talked about here. I give them credit. They actually work through a lot of the different things. They give them a lot of credit for that. You can be more literate, but that doesn't necessarily mean you become more supportive or more trusting, because the truth is, with being more literate about the entirety of the scientific process, you will also see some of its problems with the different agencies and institutions here. The scientific process itself perhaps might find some disagreements with. So that is distinctly possible also. Overall, that's my thoughts. I think it was actually fairly well done. That's it for now. I sorry I ran a fair bit long today. I apologize. But this was a good, fun article to get into. But scientific literacy, again, I think is a good thing. I just think getting everyone to be equally scientifically literate is a bit of a utopic dream that isn't going to happen because of choice, which they kind of sort of acknowledged in here. So I give them that in here, and for very many different reasons why that is. But that's it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget, Locals members, 8 p.m. Central Time, I'll be on live for all of you, and we can talk more about this whole mess that is scientific literacy. Until next time, of course, hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that wonderful good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, my friends.